I still remember the exact date I met Brandon, April 15, 2022. I was flipping through one of my favorite subreddits before bed when a message popped up in the chat room. Cool song in your profile picture. It's one of my favorite bands. Brandon wrote. I clicked over to his profile and was surprised to feel my heart already fluttering. He was handsome, with warm brown eyes behind black-rimmed glasses. His bio said he was a simple and fun person. I replied to him about the band, and soon we were chatting, texting for hours about music, books, movies, our shared social awkwardness. It felt strangely natural, like we were talking to an old friend. When there was a lull around 3 a.m., Brandon texted, I really enjoyed our conversation. You seem really cool. Could you please turn the conversation to text? I couldn't hide a smile as I dialed my number in response. For the next few weeks, we texted nonstop from morning to night. Brandon just pissed me off. He sent me funny memes that made me laugh out loud. He would patiently listen to me when I was stressed out about school or my mediocre job. He had a knack for making things seem better. A few times my overly logical friend James raised his eyebrows at how quickly things were happening. Don't you think you two should meet first before you talk about living together? He asked. I appreciate your concern, but I think he's fine, I shrugged. I brushed off the creeping feeling that maybe James was right. Exactly 2 weeks after we started communicating, Brandon texted, I know it's early, but I have to tell you I love you. I froze, my rational side screaming that it was too soon while my heart pounded loudly in my ears. I fought it for a few minutes before I wrote back, I think I love you too. I joked that my apartment was so tiny that even a mouse would be cramped in it. But it was all I could afford on my meager retail salary. My social life was reduced to watching Netflix on the weekends or taking lonely walks around the mall. By the time I met Brandon, loneliness had become like an old friend, familiar and predictable. Those first few months with Brandon were intoxicating. They were filled with constant conversations and an emotional closeness I had never experienced before. He made me mixtapes with love songs and wrote me poems describing my sparkling emerald eyes and silky brown hair. It was like I was living in a romance novel. My friends liked Brandon, but they were somewhat baffled by how intense our relationship was. My simpering friend Amy raised her eyebrows when I talked about Brandon for the millionth time over brunch. He just sent me a huge bouquet of roses. The card says he can't wait for me to be his wife, I practically squealed. Wife? You've only known him for 3 months, Amy said, almost choking on her mimosa. I brushed off her concern, engrossed in petting Brandon. I was spellbound, unable to see the situation clearly through the fog of infatuation. By June, Brandon started hinting that he wanted us to shorten the distance. I hate hugging you just through the tiny FaceTime screen, he said, pouting his lips sweetly. Why don't you look for a job near me in Chicago? We could rent an apartment together. In a burst of excitement, I somehow convinced myself that this was a great idea. I went through a few interviews and began to envision our future cozy life together. Brandon talked about having a dog and kids someday. Everything seemed perfect at the time. How foolish I was to ignore the warning signs in favor of a fairy tale fantasy. In late August, I pulled up to Brandon's apartment in Chicago with all of my worldly belongings haphazardly stuffed into my aging Toyota Corolla. Brandon greeted me with a huge bouquet of daisies, my favorite. Welcome home, baby, he said, flashing his eyes behind the panes of his glasses. The first few weeks were like a romantic montage from a movie, cooking dinner together over a glass of wine, cuddling on the couch watching shows, lazy Sunday walks around town hand in hand. But soon the cracks began to show. Brandon seemed to be very picky about the upkeep of the apartment. Could you please remember to rinse the dishes completely before putting them in the dishwasher? He sighed after discovering a speck of food on his plate. When I suggested getting a dog from the shelter, as we discussed, Brandon faltered. Considering we both work, it's just not fair to leave a dog alone all day, he said. Maybe in a few years. Little things were gradually happening that seemed wrong. Brandon was getting messages late at night, which he brushed off as just work stuff. He started working late, and the long hours started to wear him down. I tried to be supportive, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of anxiety. One night we were making dinner when Brandon became uncharacteristically quiet, picking at his food. "You okay? Rough day?" I asked softly. "No, just not feeling too good. In fact, I haven't felt like this in a while," he said. As he described the symptoms of fatigue, stomach aches, and night sweats, my anxiety grew. "You really should go to the doctor, baby," I finally said. He went the next day. When he got home, his face was ashy white. "It's cancer," he gasped. "I have to start chemotherapy immediately at home in New York." I felt like the floor had fallen beneath my feet. How could it be that something so terrible had burst into my fairy tale so suddenly? I was shocked, but the truth was soon to become even more shocking. The next few weeks turned into a string of tearful conversations, painful medical tests, and Brandon's ever-increasing malaise from chemo. He had to quit his job. His family wanted him to come home to Buffalo and undergo treatment. I told him I would go with him, but he urged me to stay and work. "You can't give up your life for me," he said, lowering his eyes. "I need to get through this so I can recover and come back to you." I finally agreed, and my heart was tearing apart as I drove him to the airport. "Kick cancer's ass, okay?" I gasped between sobs. "I'll be waiting for you when you're done with all of this." The months dragged on agonizingly. I couldn't concentrate on work, constantly checking my phone for updates. To my frustration, Brandon began to communicate with me less and less. He said it was all about fatigue, his phone running out of battery frequently, and the poor cell service at the hospital. One night I was sitting home alone, crying into my wine glass, when a chat notification popped up on my screen. It was James, my friend, who had questioned how quickly Brandon and I had moved in at the beginning. "Hey, just thought you should know. I saw some messages that suggest Brandon might not be in Buffalo anymore," his message critically read. My heart raced, and I began frantically asking for details. As James sent me screenshots, the truth slowly shattered my entire reality. Brandon is smiling happily with some brunette in a New York restaurant. And he doesn't look like he's sick with cancer at all. Suddenly, a lot of things fell into place. I talked to Brandon on the phone, rage building as he stammered excuses, but finally admitted he made the whole thing up to leave me for another woman. I was utterly destroyed, embarrassed, heartbroken, and angry all at the same time. I felt like an idiot, ignoring all signs in favor of fantasy. But after weeks of torment, I realized that if I told my story, I might be able to help someone else avoid making the same mistakes.